Good evening, welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme tonight. With some of the finest experts anywhere in the world, we do a deep dive into the situation in Russia. The events over the weekend with the mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin almost getting into Moscow in what seemed to be an out-and-out coup has stunned the world. He stopped at the last second, no one knows why. Where does this leave Vladimir Putin now? That's what we are looking at. Later on the show at 5:30, the World Economic Forum has released a detailed survey of 10 key technologies which will change our lives in the next 5 years. I'll be joined by the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum as we look at these technologies and the profound chances of an impact on the lives of billions. But let's start with a deep dive into the situation in Russia. I'm joined by Glenn Carl. He's been a career CIA officer. He's been tracking Russia very closely indeed. Thanks very much for being with us, Mr. Carl. Why did Yevgeny Prigozhin do what he did? If his intention was not to get into Moscow, what did he really achieve?
Well, he's a fascinating character and hard to read, and some of his actions and statements seem to be not well thought out. He has frequently done his commentary videos from the front and from his command places while apparently inebriated. So one has to question how carefully he has thought out some of his steps. And yet we now have all heard that the U.S. intelligence community was aware days before Prigozhin's march on Moscow that he was planning to do this, so that it wasn't a capricious act. He seems to have backed off. We also now hear, for two reasons which I find pretty compelling. The first, and the less compelling but still powerful, is that the Russian intelligence services informed Prigozhin and his commanders, as this was unfolding, that if they continued, they would kill all the family members of the commanders in Russia. And then the second thing was the correlation of forces. Those marching on Moscow with Prigozhin, his Wagner group, didn't have a large number of amount of armor, or numbers of men, and they seem to have been, the commanders, or Prigozhin, less encouraged by the responses of the Russian military to their approaches than they had hoped. So that seems to be what happened. He got cold feet, and now he's in a pickle.
Where does this leave Vladimir Putin?
Well, everyone says the conventional expert pundit wisdom of us all, I don't know if I include myself in that that group, but is that Putin is weakened. And I guess that is true, because it certainly shows that all is not well in Russia land, or Putin land. But so long as he controls the intelligence services and the guns, then he will be hard to challenge. He is ruthless. He throws people out of windows, or they die smoking, or various things. And there are dozens of people who have suffered that fate. So I am not certain that how fragile he is. I think a totalitarian regime is brittle. And now maybe Russia is living a similar situation to that of ancient Rome, where a succession was always decided by those who controlled the army, or the various parts of the army, or the military, the weapons. We don't know.
What struck me the other day was, while there wasn't very much in terms of an active offensive against Prigozhin's forces, they may not actively have joined Prigozhin's forces, but they didn't hit out at him earlier, which would suggest that perhaps going forward, the issue of loyalty of the Russian army to Putin would perhaps be his biggest concern.
I think that's a very good point. I think we have seen evidence in this whole drama with Prigozhin that the military and the power centers even, as well as the public, but particularly the military, are less invested than Putin in the invasion, and are wondering what the point of it is, since hundreds of thousands are dying to what real end. And there Prigozhin spoke truth to power. And whether it was heard by the Russian population or influence centers remains to be seen.
Those who engage in a coup any part of the world, a military coup, it doesn't usually end well for them. So Prigozhin landing up in Belarus would be acutely aware of the fact that his days might just be numbered.
I think we all feel this way. Certainly, where is there to hide? The Russian intelligence service has a long and endlessly persistent arm. You know, Trotsky, it took years, 70 years ago, for the Soviet Union or Stalin to kill Trotsky, his great rival. But there have been, at least as I recall, 49 instances of assassination in the United Kingdom in the last 15 years or so by Russian intelligence services. There's a report that there was a happily failed attempt by the Russians to kill a former member of their intelligence service who had defected or had been working with the CIA in the United States, and that crosses all sorts of red lines for the unwritten code of conduct among intelligence services, or at least Russians and the Americans. So Prigozhin is no dummy in that regard, since he's as ruthless as anyone else in Russia, and it's shocking that he would have turned around, because the alternative is endlessly to have to be on his guard, and the Russians will not let up.
Where does this leave the fight in Ukraine?
Well, had it being the march on Moscow, or fighting continued for just a little while longer, and had there been actually more substantial clashes between the government and the Wagner group, then we may well have seen a removal of some forces from Ukraine, or at least their discombobulation. But that didn't happen. It was less than 24 hours, and the Ukrainian intelligence service and military have reported that they detected no change in the posture or the competence or the actions of the Russians fighting in Ukraine. So short term, it's had no discernible effect. Now, longer term, will it affect morale? Will it affect disposition of forces, as the Russians may decide that they have other priorities they have to address? That remains to be seen. But for the moment, it's the status quo as it was.
Would the world perhaps be more secure with Putin in charge? I ask because he's been a factor that the world has seen for several decades now. In Russia, a country with so many nuclear weapons, tactical weapons stored all across the country, if there was an X factor like a Prigozhin who hypothetically succeeded in a coup, or somebody like him who came to power, there would be an added element of instability, some would suggest. Almost in a strange way, would the world be safer, more secure with Putin in charge?
Right. Well, that seems to have been, in a sense, the calculation of the Biden administration, that there's always, and it's not just the Biden administration, with a major nuclear power, and there are very few, instability is a frightening prospect, because who will secure, control, and dispose of the several thousand nuclear weapons that are in Russia? I know from my own experience, my own career, that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States and NATO allies were tremendously concerned about what happens with the nuclear weapons, and are they actually effectively guarded? Or is the command and control secure, not capricious? So instability raises that to a very high concern. Now, whether it would be better or worse with a Prigozhin, he's an ultra-nationalist, he is capricious, he is ruthless, in some ways more nationalistic, it seems, or aggressive in his rhetoric anyway, than Putin, less rationally calculating, possibly. So that would have been a concern. I mean, this is a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea. And for the moment, we still have the devil.
Doesn't it strike you as being interesting that the reactions from the United States or the United Kingdom have been utterly muted by and large to the situation in Russia. It almost seemed as if in such a volatile situation, any statement made by, say, President Biden or somebody senior would be used as, or would be weaponized and would be used to suggest that all of this was happening with Western assistance.
Yes, well, that's, I think, a spot-on assessment and observation. And then we hear, I think, intentional background comments from the Biden administration that the administration went to great lengths to have nothing to say about the turmoil in Russia and the UK too, I think, and other responsible states. Because, and I can tell you from personal experience, at my own level, which is of course orders down from the White House, that the Russians will misconstrue and actively, aggressively, consciously misrepresent statements that I make to harm the U.S. and to advance their own position. So anything that the U.S. government had to say, anything would have been turned against actually U.S. intentions and to one faction or another in Russia's own objectives in a hostile way. Definitely, I was blamed as to be one of the creators of Al Qaeda when that's absolutely the reverse of what was the case. But that's how it works with Russian intelligence.
All right, Dad, wonderful speaking to you again. Thank you very much. It's an evolving situation. I would suggest the crisis in Russia is not quite over at the moment. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Joining us now, Tatiana Kokhareva. Is there any clarity in Russia on what Yevgeny Prigozhin was trying to achieve?
I believe that Yevgeny Prigozhin was very clear on what he wanted to achieve in his declaration that he put out, when this whole thing started. What he did achieve is a different story, and that probably is the one that we should be focusing on.
Right, and has this left Vladimir Putin weaker?
Well, look, I've been listening to your previous speaker. He does kind of strike interesting points, but in the meantime, we have to understand that according to the press service of the Belarusian president, the first thing that they said, that the negotiations that were going on between Mr. Lukashenko and Mr. Prigozhin were completely coordinated and kind of entrusted to him by Vladimir Putin. So that was delegated to him by the Russian president, which means that this in no way, shape or form can leave him weakened. Mm-hmm. Delegated the problem. And he solved it, essentially. And also just to make put things in a little bit of a perspective.
Sure.
Despite what Yevgeny Prigozhin claimed in his own videos, in no way was he anywhere near 200 kilometers outside of Moscow, because 200 kilometers outside of Moscow would have put him in Tula region, and we know for a fact that the column never entered the region itself, so that actually puts him about 450 kilometers outside of the capital.
Okay.
It's also an interesting kind of, detail.
So, again, social media video seems to suggest otherwise, but be that as it may, the fact that so many Russian units all along your M4 route chose to do nothing essentially. There were a few attempts on him. He shot down Russian aircraft. Is there a real worry about the loyalty of formations in the Russian army to your leadership, given the fact that he could have been stopped, perhaps even before he got to Rostov, or certainly once he started moving out of Rostov. But that didn't happen. He chose to leave or exit when he wanted to exit.
Well, see, that's a matter of perspective. You say when he wanted to exit, and that's certainly the picture that was allowed to kind of be put forward. But again, the only thing it does not discredit him completely. It does not discredit the authorities in any way because, again, might be that as it may, you think that he was that close to the capital. Again, we're here in Russia, I'm here in Moscow, and we know for a fact that he was nowhere near even the Tula region.
Okay.
Again, and the worst thing that we can do, and we've found that out many times over, is getting information from social media, because you know just exactly how easily that could be manipulated. In the meantime, we have to remember the city of Rostov itself is 1,100 kilometers outside of the capital. It is the closest city to the border. Yes, that is very, very much correct. Did he enter the headquarters and did he take control of it? Yes, he did. If we're talking about so many units that kind of clung to his side and decided to do nothing, that is categorically untrue.
Tatiana, assuming, and again, we don't know whether it's actually happened, General Gerasimov and the Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, do they remain in their same positions? Because what we did hear Prigozhin say is that he had problems with both and that both had to essentially go. Is there any indicator to suggest that President Putin is complying with that demand?
Well, if you've been paying attention to what's actually going on on the ground, and that's exactly what the president actually spoke about, is that we have to have a bigger picture, and the most important thing is what's happening on the ground, on the battlefield. Yes. Early this morning, Minister of Defense Shoigu was shown visiting people on the front line. He visited the soldiers. He spoke there. He addressed the soldiers. He did, it was shown everywhere. So I don't think that such, a show suggests in any way that he is in danger of being, dismissed.
And General Gerasimov?
I don't think, and I don't believe that that is to happen anytime soon. But again, the one thing that we do not know, and we don't know that just as much as you don't know that, is exactly what was in that agreement that happened between Mr. Prigozhin and Mr. Lukashenko. We do know that there are safety guarantees for Wagner fighters, and also, again, one little detail, which is not so little when you look at it from the ground perspective, is that all of the Wagner fighters did not support the march. And that means, and that's also been said, that those who didn't support the march are very welcome to join the Russian armed forces and to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense.
Yes. And that has been the Russian position, that look, you need to sign contracts, and that is what Prigozhin has opposed in the recent past. However, and here is where footage does tend to be reliable, because we try and fact check as much as possible. Most of the times we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong, but there was an Ilyushin-22 aircraft which was shot down. There was possibly a Kama-52 helicopter which was shot down within Russian airspace. Now, if there is an agreement which has been signed which ensures that Wagner forces are not culpable for murdering Russian citizens, isn't that deeply problematic?
Well, look, let's look at it from the other point of view. If there is indeed what you say there is, then shouldn't the Ministry of Defense be confirming it? And if they are not confirming it, and they haven't spoken a word about it, then that's what we are left with. You know as well as I do. There's a lot of stuff circulating on social media. And in this conflict, it's been the dirtiest one so far. Yeah. There's so many videos that we can't possibly prove, we can't possibly authenticate. And I do believe that it is a part of responsible journalism. And for us, for all of us to kind of, remember that there is such a thing as a non-confirmed piece of information.
Tatiana, final question to you. When all of this was happening on Saturday, what were you thinking? What were your friends, your family thinking as these Wagner forces started moving towards Moscow? For us, sitting far away in India, it seemed unreal. It seemed unbelievable that in a nuclear power, a country as strong as Russia, that something as bizarre as this would be taking place. Those were our thoughts. But sitting over there in Moscow with your friends, your family, perhaps your parents, what were you thinking? I mean, I'm not asking as a journalist what you're thinking. We know your thoughts as a journalist, as a Russian citizen.
Look, as a Russian citizen who lived through much scarier stuff, speaking out, I was born and I was actually, I was not, I think I was 7 when the putsch happened. So I remember tanks driving through Moscow.
Yes.
And that was that I remember very vividly. In the meantime, as a person who follows the news as much as, being involved in making the news, the part that you need to understand is that Yevgeny Prigozhin is very eccentric. That would be the word that I would use to describe him in terms of what he puts out into the information field.
Yes.
Again, as a person actually driven along M4 a gazillion times, I know exactly where the column was, and we were watching it, but I don't believe that, that there was that much nervousness, I guess, in the air, because I went to the gym on Saturday when that was thing, and people were walking around in the streets with their babies. It was sunny. Restaurants were full of people. People were eating, laughing. I would not classify that as, extremely worried.
Sure.
Capital of Russia.
Sure.
And when it comes to my parents, they were completely not worried. But they are very kind of old school Russians.
Sure.
We worry about something when it actually comes to it.
Tatiana, wonderful speaking to you. And thank you so much for sharing that perspective. It's great to get that perspective in on this story. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Always a pleasure.
Joining us now, a very special guest, Dan Smith, the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Thanks very much, Mr. Smith, for being with us. What was Prigozhin's goal?
Well, I think that, like so much else, this remains unclear. I think, first of all, you have to characterize it as a mutiny. It was aimed against Shoigu, the defense minister, and General Gerasimov, the head of the armed forces. And when he started out upon this road, it seems like Yevgeny Prigozhin was, in some ways, attempting to keep his insurrection, if you want to call it that, targeted against those individuals and others whom he believes have sabotaged in one way or another the war effort in Ukraine. And President Putin was not one of his targets. It then seems as if at some point during Saturday that may have slipped a bit. And suddenly Prigozhin finds himself on the way to Moscow, not being really properly resisted by anything, by any force that Russia might put up against, neither the army, nor the police, nor the Rosgvardia National Guard. It seems like Putin and the core of the leadership elite has left Moscow. Yep. And perhaps then Prigozhin is confronted with the question himself of, what am I doing here? How far do I really want to go? And then, amidst still somewhat cloudy circumstances, he turns back. So I'm sorry, in a way, the answer to so many of these questions is going to be, as yet, it's a little bit too soon to tell.
What about the Belarusian peace proposal? I mean, an 11th hour peace proposal. What do you suspect was so dramatic about this peace proposal that Prigozhin, just 200 kilometers south of Moscow, decided not to go ahead with anything, when in fact Russian soldiers were not really opposing him?
I think that it saved Prigozhin from the challenge of figuring out how to not only take over a major city, Rostov-on-the-Don,
yep,
but then the capital, Moscow, and then perhaps the state. I mean, people were not coming out in large numbers in the streets to cheer him on or to block him. This was this is a battle between the elite. There were some signs in Rostov that people came out on the streets welcoming and waving and cheering, but I don't think there was really signs of a real flood of support for him, just as no real signs of real opposition to him. So I think that perhaps this proposal, in a sense, got him off the hook of the challenge that he'd made for himself. The second thing, which I think is important about the proposal, is I really do not believe it came from President Lukashenko of Belarus. I believe that this was worked out between the Russia's National Security Council, perhaps some other elements in the leadership in the Kremlin, and Prigozhin needed Lukashenko to be the one who seemed to be facilitating the deal. But I don't think that Lukashenko himself is the originator of this.
How has this left Vladimir Putin weakened? Has it?
Yes, I think there is no doubt about that. He apparently did not have forces available that he could call on to put a decisive stop to a uprising, however we exactly define or characterize it, by a force which is, after all, 25,000 men, when Russian armed forces are 35 to 40 times that size. Well, the Russian army is. He declared that this was a criminal action and that there would be, punishment, and instead has agreed to a deal whereby Prigozhin himself goes to Belarus. We don't know if there are conditions on that, but he seems to get off scot-free to Belarus. And meanwhile, the Wagner fighters, they also return. They're not going to be charged, convicted either. So to me, this feels like real signs of weakness from Vladimir Putin, who perhaps doesn't not know now exactly what it is that he controls and exactly what levers of power he has to use. Whether this weakness will last for long, how he might reassert his grip, these are questions for the crystal ball at the moment.
Coup attempts usually end one way. Now, it just seems rather unreal, if you just look at history around the world, that Prigozhin would just walk away free, and yet that's exactly what appears to have happened. He would be aware of the risk to his own life in Belarus or wherever he chooses to go. How is this a win-win situation for Prigozhin, is my question. I mean, what has he really achieved?
I think that I do not think Prigozhin is a winner in this, even if I think that Putin is a loser. And this, I think, is part of the oddity of the situation and why we're using terms like perplexity and puzzle and paradox and unreal or indeed surreal. I mean, as you said in your question, this is a very, very weird situation. A coup, possibly attempt, we're not quite sure if it was or not, is mounted. It seems to be heading towards success. There's no active opposition to it. It's stopped. Everybody who was going to be punished is now being allowed free. It is very strange. I am one of those who thinks that probably we will next see Prigozhin, if we do see him, in some other country.
Yeah.
In one of the countries where Wagner has become an important force for the government and where the country has become an important source of wealth for Wagner. So I don't think that Prigozhin will stay very long in Belarus, but that's just my speculation.
What does this mean for the war in Ukraine? If Wagner's forces lack Prigozhin's leadership and are still committed to the fight in Ukraine, would they be as effective, or do you sense that with the removal of Wagner's forces as a cohesive fighting entity, this could signify the beginning of the end of the Ukraine conflict?
Well, I think there's two or three questions bound up in that. The first one is Prigozhin as a leader. He was clearly the public voice. He is the political voice, and he would seem to be making the strategic and corporate decisions about Wagner and its operations. But whether he is the detailed commander on the ground that we kind of assume from him turning up with his fellow soldiers wearing his combat dress and using a lot of profanity in his speech. I mean, whether he really had operational command on the ground, that could be questionable for somebody with his background, which includes no military training whatsoever at any point. So the second thing then is, without his political voice, without that public face, does Wagner hang together? And that, I think, will depend on the quality of what has so far been the second level leadership of Wagner, and whether somebody emerges who's able to coordinate the whole, or whether it fragments. Now, if it does fragment, whether it fragments into, like 4 or 5 fractions, or whether, in fact, the fighters just get absorbed into Russian armed forces, I think then that is the loss of a really significant part of the offensive power of Russian forces in Ukraine, but not necessarily such an important part of their defensive strength. They have been, as there's been a lot of commentary about, developing really quite in-depth defenses on the ground, which will make any Ukrainian advance very slow, and I doubt if that will change very much. However, it could be that out of this, in a kind of knock-on process through the next few weeks in a hot summer, you start to get a real demoralization amongst Russian forces in the field, a real sense that, yes, we are being left here just to fry and to suffer. Yes, actually, Prigozhin was right. And that, I think, then would be, as you put it, perhaps the beginning of the end.
So again, just returning to the Prigozhin question, would you therefore suggest, and we're all looking for answers, and I'm not sure it's easily available, that his immediate goal of having Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, sidelined, and General Gerasimov potentially sidelined as well, is part of the deal that he's worked out? Because if that is not achieved, then whatever else he's achieved seems even more vague.
Yes, I agree with you in your reading of it. If those two shifts of command personnel, the defense minister and the head of the armed forces, if they stay in place, you would start to feel that really what Prigozhin had achieved was a demonstration of the weakness of the Russian state and of the Russian president, but he hadn't achieved anything in terms of gain for himself. If they are removed, it's still questionable what he has achieved if he remains in semi-exile in Belarus or somewhere else, especially if Wagner begins to fragment at all. Of course, success for him, victory, would be that Shoigu and Gerasimov are replaced, that he, Prigozhin, is welcomed back to Russia and is in charge of the Wagner fighting forces again, and the war goes on before. But I don't think that President Putin can afford for that to happen. So I think we can see the factors in the equation, but we're not quite sure which side of the equal sign they're going to fall.
A final question to you. Are Russia's nuclear weapons, specifically tactical nuclear weapons, secure, to the best of your understanding?
Yes, so far, and to the best of my understanding and that of our people here in Cyprus, yes, they are secure. There are not specific short-term concerns or worries about those, including those that are supposed to have been allocated to be deployed into Belarus. But of course, in the longer term, the worries about a finger on the nuclear button, which is potentially belonging to somebody who may be as worried and insecure about his position as President Putin might be, those worries will persist over the longer term. But short term, no problem so far as we can see.
All right. Dan Smith, wonderful speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us with that analysis of this situation. In its latest report on key technologies that may have a profound global impact, the World Economic Forum has identified 10 technologies that will have a positive impact on society in the next 3 to 5 years. The World Economic Forum report is important and has been accurate in the past in crystal gazing into future technology. In fact, some of the leads identified have gone on to win Nobel Prizes for science. The technologies in question, the World Economic Forum says, have the power to disrupt industries, grow economies, improve lives and safeguard the planet if designed, scaled and deployed responsibly. So in a few moments from now, we'll be joined by Jeremy Yevgeny, the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum. But first up, a look at some of these technologies and their potential impact on billions. For starters, flexible batteries, the rapidly escalating development of wearable devices, flexible electronics and bendable displays demand that power sources match the agility of these systems. So think about it, batteries which actually bend. Now the forecasted growth of the global flexible battery market between 2022 and 2027 is $240 million. Let's talk about general artificial intelligence. Now general artificial intelligence, or AI, is a powerful type of generative artificial intelligence, is a powerful type of AI that can create new and original content by learning patterns in data using complex algorithms and methods of learning which have been inspired by the human brain. Now, at this stage, we've all heard about ChatGPT, but the future uses of this will be far, far more significant, much more profound. Sustainable aviation fuel, moving the aviation industry towards net zero carbon emissions. Designer phages, engineering viruses to augment human, animal and plant health. The end result, the treatment of serious illnesses. The metaverse for mental health, that's been identified as well. Shared virtual spaces to improve mental health. Wearable plant sensors, revolutionizing agriculture data collection to feed the world. Think about it, this is absolutely profound. If farmers in India know about the exact status of their crops and their plants, then it could have profound impact on food production. Spatial omics, that's molecular level mapping of biological processes to unlock life's mysteries. And I promise you, if you think this is all very complicated, we'll be breaking this down for you in just a few moments. Flexible neural electronics, in other words, better engineered circuits to interface with the nervous system. Sustainable computing is important for the future. What is sustainable computing? Well, designing and implementing net zero energy data centers which facilitate, for example, Google searches, email, the metaverse, AI, and a myriad of other aspects of an increasingly data-based society. This consumes a whopping 1% of the total electricity produced globally. So you need to have sustainable computer systems which bring down these costs substantially. AI facilitated healthcare, new technologies to improve the efficiency of healthcare systems. Wonderful, Jeremy, to speak to you again. Before we actually talk about the technologies, could you tell us about the basis on which they've been shortlisted?
We actually used 5 criteria. You mentioned equity was one of them. We also looked at people, the way that improves people's livelihoods, planet or sustainability, right? The impact they can have on that in the sustainability domain. And then as well, prosperity, how much can this actually create wealth or employment? And last, the potential to be disruptive within industry. So we use these 5 elements. Arguably, equity and the importance to people's individual lives is the most important. At the forum, we talk about a human fourth industrial revolution. And, when we selected these technologies, that was very much at the heart of the selection process.
Ultimately, there's a profound economic impact of this, right? Within the next 5 years, you expect some of these technologies to have a transformative impact. That's the point that we're making here.
Definitely. We believe that all of them will have a transformative impact, both in the near term, the next 5 years. Looking beyond 5 years, it's actually really hard to predict, right? If you try and think of 5 years ago, all of the things that are present today, whether technologically, economically, geopolitically, I'd have to say, we wouldn't have been able to imagine it. Or possibly we would have imagined it, but we couldn't have predicted that it would turn out the way it is. I think as the pace of technological development continues to accelerate, when we talk about this exponential growth, it makes it even more difficult to predict further out into the future. But some of these near-term estimates we can already see because of investment flows, the demand, and so on, that they will have a substantive economic impact.
Now, I think it's amazing that some of the technologies which you identified years back went on to win or become Nobel Prize winning science, mRNA vaccines, for example. But let's talk a little bit about some of the technologies that you've now identified. Flexible batteries forecast to grow between 2022 and 2027 massively. Could you give us an idea of how flexible batteries have already started changing our lives?
Great. Look, you can look at a number of different areas. We've seen the release of recent headset devices from some of the companies and say, okay, you'll need to carry your battery pack with you. Now, imagine if the battery pack was actually built into your shirt or in your pants, then you actually have a power system that's continually embedded within your clothes. Similarly, if you think in the medical sector, the ability to have sensors that are powered, they can actually fit the exact circumstances or the need in that case. And you can imagine, being able to use sensor technology in a much wider range of use cases and for longer periods of time with more ease of use of for the end user there.
Mr. Yevgeny, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. The world knows, for example, about ChatGPT. But the applications going forward are much more significant than that. And that's what we're essentially talking about. So in the future, how can we actually look at generative AI? Where would it take us?
Well, that's a $1 billion, not a $1 trillion question. But as we look out to generative AI, I think there's a few, key elements that we have to work through. There's a tension between whether we'll have kind of closed models or we'll have open source models. The debate is still out on that one. I suspect personally that we'll see a mix. We'll see both cases. Another question comes to, how large can the models get? You actually have a point of probably declining returns where we don't necessarily have the generation of new information that feed the models. But will we see more specialized models, right? So we end up having a health, model dedicated for healthcare, or a model dedicated for finance, or a model dedicated for agriculture. All these domains, you can imagine much more specialized models in place there. And of course, there's the question of where does the data come from? Who owns that data? What are the benefits there? What biases does the data potentially carry with it? These are all issues that we're still in the very early stages of working through. Nonetheless, given the profound and deep kind of transformative potential it has both economically, socially, and politically, we'll see continued advances in this space, and I actually expect that it'll continue to accelerate quite rapidly, even if we can't answer all those questions today.
Designer phages which engineer viruses to augment human, animal and plant health, that's fascinating. Essentially, we are in a position to design viruses to kill other viruses, and what we're talking about is technology very different from vaccines, right?
This is correct. What we're looking at here is also in the microbiome. So there's increasing recognition that the biological system within which we operate isn't contained just within our individual bodies or within the individual structure of a plant or tree, but actually extends out into a wider ecosystem. We're still just at the very early stages of understanding how these systems interact, what implications they have. And again, this is an area that with increased tools, increased research going into these domains, I expect that we'll continue to learn more and more. And if we look back, just to the CRISPR development, it's just a little over a decade old, right? And so that's just at the editing level. And now we move into synthetic biology, which is even less than a decade old, where you actually can create synthetic structures. And now we start looking into the microbiome domain. And again, so just as we see incredible advances related to CRISPR, now synthetic biology, we expect this to be kind of the next frontier in the biological domains.
Mr. Yevgeny, how can the metaverse be used for mental health applications?
Yeah, that's a great question. We see a number of use cases where now some doctors are using the metaverse as part of therapy. So it actually can help people experience a different environment, create empathy, individuals that have certain fears, concerns, different elements. The metaverse acts as kind of an intermediary interaction space that people can better explore, better understand themselves, and work with the therapist for improved mental health.
Plant sensors, I mean, that's incredible, particularly in my country, in India. We depend so heavily on the monsoon. If farmers are able to get a clearer idea of the condition of their crops based on sensors which are actually there on the crops, it could have a transformative impact in terms of food production for 1 billion plus. When we talk about variable plant sensors, what exactly is the technology? How does it work?
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned this one. The selection of this was definitely influenced by some of the work that we've been doing in Telangana and other states in India. We had our AI for Agricultural Initiative there. I recall visiting Telangana last year, and we were looking at the use of drones there. So you can imagine, almost like 3 layers. What happens on the ground? Then you have another layer that you can observe with drones, and you even have a layer where you can actually use space and satellite technologies to improve agriculture. So almost like a physical stack, when we talk about the technology stack here. Plant sensors are just one additional element to that stack, where through improved data collection and monitoring, we can actually improve the application of water, for irrigation, pesticides, detect, invasions. So a whole number of factors that we can understand the plant health, the soil health, and respond to that in a proactive way. And as a result, increase yields, reduce wastage, and improve the time to market. So all the factors that go in, this just becomes one more layer in that technology stack, and a very important one.
Spatial omics, frankly, I had not known about spatial omics before I read your report. So essentially you're talking about molecular level mapping of biological processes to unlock the mysteries of life. What are the questions to which we seek answers?
Yeah, so here with spatial omics, we start to understand that there's 37 trillion cells approximately. I think in the report we said 37.2 trillion cells. Hard to measure when you get to those numbers. Again, all of those cellular structures are interacting with one another, responding in different ways. Spatial omics actually helps us better understand the relationships among those cells in the environment in which they interact. And this is a very new area, and kind of domain that wasn't possible 10 years ago, right? We didn't have the compute power even to monitor or model any of these types of elements. So there are things that we might have been able to do mathematically, but in a practical sense, you weren't able to apply it. Now we're actually, with these new technologies, increased compute power, improved storage, improved visualization, data visualization techniques, all these things coming together in spatial omics to actually allow us an improved understanding of these 37 trillion cells and their role in human health.
One final question, Mr. Yevgeny. Flexible neural electronics. What is the future that that you have identified as being so profound?
Yeah, in the near term, I definitely see the emphasis is going to be actually on helping improve quality of life for individuals who are paralyzed, lost mobility, and for someone who's been in a situation that they're unable to walk or move a certain limb of the body. This is a pretty life-changing experience. We're still in the early stages, but we see now with the clinical trials that have been conducted, really rapid progress. And again, this is something that's been enabled by improved compute power, improved sensors throughout. I don't want to look out further into the future, but at least in the near term, we see immediate benefits to improve individuals' quality of life, to mitigate or adapt to personal health situations they may be in there.
All right, Mr. Yevgeny, lovely speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed for identifying, these technologies and telling us a little bit about it. The future will be transformed once this actually comes of age in many cases. Thank you very much indeed.